With these two images here, we are in for another comparison, another nice comparison, because it's showing the same subject matter, the same purpose, but we can see how things are changing as we move from left to right-hand side. The left-hand side is by Cimabue. Cimabue's painting comes to us from about 1280. You can see from the shape, triangular shape like we saw with St. Francis. This is an altarpiece, same with the image here on the right-hand side. You can even see the hinges here that would hold the doors. It could be open and closed, and those doors would again sort of reveal more sort of imagery to the viewer. Cimabue is really known as sort of the last in the line of great Byzantine artists. So I want to start with this image and talk about those Byzantine qualities. First thing, very long and willowy figures. Another Byzantine trait of the Middle Ages, of course, all of that gold leaf. Our Christ figure, seen more as sort of a miniature, fully formed human that's just sort of shrunken down to baby size. The term for this is a homunculus, a miniature, full-formed human. It comes from 16th century sort of interest in alchemy, but it just denotes this idea that you don't really get a soft, squishy, full-formed baby, but rather sort of shrunken, skinny adult. Lots of gold leaf here, especially in these halos. And the other things I want you to see is how we have formed space, or the lack of space. There really is no background, and our figures are placed on what's called the ladder. This is called ladder perspective. It's a very, very rudimentary, simplistic way to create space where the figures look like they're stacked up on a ladder, and to your eye, it's supposed to appear as though the one at the top is the furthest one back. So that's called ladder perspective. We have figures here from the Old Testament at the bottom. Again, the throne isn't really placed anywhere. The whole thing sort of floats around. These Old Testament figures are oftentimes seen around the infant Christ. They foretold the coming of Christ, and then here he is. And so it sort of legitimizes Christ as the Son of God. It was foretold, and it came to fruition. I want to compare Cimabue's altarpiece from 1280 to Giotto's altarpiece from 1310 so that we can see where these new Renaissance traits are. Giotto makes the final break with the Byzantine tradition. So we're sort of looking at the old and sort of bringing in the new here. Giotto is known for breaking with the past because he practiced empirical art. You could also call it empiricism, and that means relying on sight, the creation of a work of art that is based on observation, on using the eye. So gaining knowledge of the world based on what you see, and how a figure is formed, how light bounces off the body. So really just using sight in order to really sort of replicate the natural world. So we want to sort of see how empiricism practiced by Giotto here makes a difference in how these two Virgin Marys are created. Let's talk first about the similarities. What's the same between these two? Number one, they're both altarpieces, that sacred backdrop for the Mass. They are both icons. Remember, an icon is a painting or a sculpture of a sacred image for veneration. It doesn't tell a story. It's usually a figure, oftentimes the Virgin Mary and Christ, and they are there to sort of receive your prayers. So not a narrative, but rather an icon. Our Virgin Mary is presented the same as well. She is the Queen of Heaven. That's a popular depiction of the Virgin Mary when she is surrounded by angels and saints. You see the Queen of Heaven on both sides here. She's also the throne of wisdom. The throne of wisdom means that she is, or the seat of wisdom. She provides a seat for Christ, and Christ is the wisdom of God. So as you see, Christ here is the wisdom of God, and she provides a seat for him. So we call her the seat of wisdom, or also the throne of wisdom. Other similarities are hierarchical proportioning. You also call that hieratic scale, either one. She's larger, so she's more important. And so you see that on both of these. So you see these smaller angels on the outsides. They're in the same plane as her. They should be as large as her, but they're not as important. So hierarchical proportioning. A lot of gold in the background, so she is definitely removed from sort of ordinary world of experience. But let's talk about some of the differences here. Number one, on the left-hand side, we said that this is ladder perspective. Here, we have a little bit of ladder perspective, but there's a lot more emphasis on overlap. See here where each angel gets their sort of due course on this ladder. Here, the figures are kind of overlapping, so that's almost like they're tilting a little bit back in space instead of going straight up and down. So we're starting to see at least some interest in creating space. The next thing, these angels down here are concrete and they're on the ground. It gives you a sense of place. It shows us that they're definitely grounded, rather than here where you really don't get enough of a ground line. You don't really see much of a ground line at all. You don't really get a sense that they're placed and that they're sort of static. So we definitely see that, gives them that sort of weightiness, and they're actually sort of starting to conquer a bit of a solid form. The big thing that I want you to see between these two is what's called chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is the use of light and dark in order to model a form. Chiaroscuro is Chiaroscuro. That's a term on your term list, but spelling can be a little confusing, so I spell it for you, chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is the use of light and dark to model a form. So let's zoom in so that we can see this. When you look here on the knee of the Virgin Mary, you can compare it to the legs of the Virgin Mary on this side. When light hits the Virgin Mary here on the left-hand side, it creates more flakes of gold leaf. And so you see this gold leaf, and that's light hitting the body of the Virgin Mary. But this is chiaroscuro. This is why Giotto is sort of the break with the Byzantine past. Light hits the knee of the Virgin Mary, it creates a lighter color blue, and then as it recesses away from us, it gets darker, 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 darker. So it's the use of light to dark in order to model this form. It gives her a sense of weightedness and of groundedness. You can see the body of the Virgin Mary underneath, like we saw with our pulpit example. Here you just see it in paint. And so it's a big deal. So you see that chiaroscuro there, and you can see it in the chest and in the face with the shadows that are created down below. It's important to note as we look at these two examples that it again shows that we are moving towards this Renaissance aesthetic. We are bringing back the humanism of the Greco-Roman world. We've taken still religious figures, as we had throughout the Middle Ages, but now we've sort of infused them with that humanity. We brought them back down to earth to give them some shape and some form. I'm going to move our Giotto image over here to the left-hand side so we can continue looking at Giotto and compare his icon that we see here on the left-hand side to a narrative painting. This is the interior of the Arena Chapel. It was painted by Giotto using the true fresco or the bon fresco technique. That means that it is painting on wet plaster. You may recognize from our Romanesque days that rounded barrel vault, the straight walls and then that curved ceiling overhead. And it's covered with stories from the life of the Virgin Mary and her parents, from the life of Christ, and then from the passion or the death of Christ. And it goes in these bands all the way around the church. I want to zoom in on one of these paintings, and it's called The Lamentation. Our year here is 1305. So we have Giotto's icon on the left, his altarpiece of our Virgin Mary, and then here we have a lamentation scene. A lamentation means that the body of Christ has been taken down off the cross, and the people lament over his body, so we call it a lamentation scene. There are a few big changes to see here. The first thing that I want you to see is that we have gotten rid of that hierarchical proportioning. Our Virgin Mary was so big here in order to put focus on intention, show her importance. Here we don't have that. But what I want you to see is what we've replaced it with. We've replaced hierarchical proportioning with something called implied line. An implied line is a real or imaginary line that creates focus. So here's a real line that is putting your focus on Christ. See this wall? It sort of ends here, right onto Christ. An imaginary line would be like these lines of sight. See these figures as they look at Christ. This is the Virgin Mary closest to him, but all these figures look down at Christ, and it creates a focal point. So it's important to note that there's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. Here, great importance is placed on the Virgin Mary because of her size through hierarchical proportioning. Here, you can still find the focal point, the most important part, but you can do it in a much more naturalistic way. And that makes sense as we're moving towards the Renaissance. The other thing to note is that we've got a great use of overlap. See how these figures overlap, which gives you a sense of space. Another thing to notice is this great interest in emotion. We said that that was a good Renaissance trait as well. Figures that are very sad show you how a real human response should look. Another figure that I want to point out to you are those figures who have their back to you. These are important figures because they help to extend space. They don't really just look like a sort of a play happening in front of you, but they actually have space kind of come out towards you because their backs are towards you, and then space moves away as well. So it gives us, opens up space. But the other thing it also does is it invites the viewer into the work because their body and their orientation is similar to ours with their back to us. But like us, they're kind of our foray or our invitation to also lament the death of Christ. Other thing to notice is this use of chiaroscuro, that light and dark that helps to model the form. And also notice too, we're losing a lot of that gold. There's very little gold leaf left here. We just see it on the halos that are there. What's important to note is that we have to discuss, well, if Giotto understood things like overlap and he understood how to create focal point without hierarchical proportioning, why didn't he do it here? This is 3 years earlier, and this is 5 years earlier. So you would think that this is sort of a linear progression, as in you learn how to do this, and then you would just apply it to every painting after that. But what I want you to really see is the purpose for these paintings, because that really dictates how much naturalism would be appropriate. The Virgin Mary here on the left-hand side is an icon. She is the sacred backdrop for the Mass. So she's going to be much more formal. She's going to have one foot more firmly placed in the past. This is a narrative. It's teaching you a lesson in a story. So the figures have to twist and move. They have to show emotion in order to show you, sort of how you should feel about this. But it's not the sacred backdrop for the Mass. It's not an icon. It's a narrative. So it is afforded a little bit more naturalism than you would see in the image here on the left-hand side.